Last episode, we saw that overthinking is not problem solving. Today, we go one level deeper. What is your relationship to the thoughts themselves? And does it have to be the relationship you currently have? Here is a moment you probably know. A thought arrives, something like, I'm going to fail this, or nobody actually likes me, or something is wrong with me. And in less than a second, it does not feel like a thought anymore. It feels like a fact. You are not someone who had the idea that they might fail. You are someone who is going to fail. The thought and the person collapse into one thing, and from inside that collapse, it is almost impossible to think clearly. What if that collapse is not inevitable? What if there is a different way to stand in relation to your own mind? This is MindScope, where we turn the science of everyday behavior into tools you can actually use. This episode is about a process researchers call cognitive defusion. The word is technical, but the idea is precise and it changes something real. Fusion is what happens when you merge with your thoughts and experience them as literal truth. Defusion is the skill of stepping back just enough to notice that a thought is a thought, not a verdict. By the end of this episode, you will understand what fusion actually costs you, where the feeling that thoughts are facts comes from, and you will have 3 concrete moves you can practice today. None of this requires you to stop having difficult thoughts. That is not the goal. The goal is to change what difficult thoughts can do to you. Let us start with the thing this episode is built on, and it comes from a framework in clinical psychology called acceptance and commitment therapy. The researchers who developed this framework, Stephen Hayes and his colleagues, described a specific problem they called cognitive fusion. It is what happens when a person treats the content of a thought as if it were a direct and accurate readout of reality. Think about what that means in practice. When you are fused with a thought, you are not evaluating it. You are inside it. The thought, I am not good enough, does not register as a perspective you are holding. It registers as a fact you have discovered. And from inside that, your whole behavioral repertoire narrows. You avoid the situation that triggered the thought, or you reassure yourself compulsively, or you freeze. The thought is now running the show. This is not a character flaw, and it is not stupidity. The human mind is extraordinarily good at treating its own output as information about the world. For most of evolutionary history, that was useful. A thought about danger was worth acting on quickly. The problem is that the same mechanism fires on psychological pain, on memories, on predictions, on self-evaluations, and on none of those is fast automatic action the right response. The mind treats the thought, I am going to be rejected, with roughly the same urgency it would treat a sign of actual physical danger. That is what makes fusion so costly. Here is where something important opens up. If you can have a thought, something in you is also capable of noticing that you are having a thought. That capacity is called metacognition, thinking about thinking. And researchers in this space, particularly the psychologist Adrian Wells, have pointed out that the problem in many forms of psychological distress is not the content of the thoughts. It is the relationship people have to those thoughts. Wells developed what he calls metacognitive therapy, and its central insight is this. When people believe their thoughts require urgent action or excessive monitoring, thinking expands to fill the available space, and distress grows not because the original thought was dangerous, but because of the strategy the person deployed in response to it. So there are 2 levels. There is the thought itself, say, I might say something embarrassing. And then there is the metacognitive response to the thought, which might be, I need to figure this out. I need to review every possible scenario. I need to make sure I have the right answer before I do anything. That second layer, the belief that you must do something about every difficult thought, is where a great deal of suffering lies. And here is the opening that creates. If the problem is partly a relationship to thoughts rather than the thoughts themselves, then the solution is not to fix the content of your thoughts. It is to change your relationship to them. That is the heart of defusion. And it turns out you can do that without eliminating a single negative thought from your mind. So what does defusion actually change? Research on this gives a fairly clear answer. In studies examining the technique, defusion exercises reliably reduced the believability of difficult thoughts and the distress they produced, even when the content of the thoughts was unchanged. Read that again, because it matters. The thought could say the same thing. The feeling attached to it dropped anyway. What changed was not the words in the thought. What changed was the weight the person gave them. This is the opposite of what most people try. Most people try to argue with the difficult thought, to replace it with a better one, or to think their way past it. Sometimes that works. But often, Arguing with a thought gives it more airtime and more credibility, because the argument itself is an implicit agreement that the thought is worth fighting. The act of wrestling confirms there is something worth wrestling with. Defusion takes a different path. Instead of engaging with the content, you step back from the process. You notice that thinking is happening. You observe the thought from a slight distance. And from that distance, the grip loosens. There is a useful metaphor here. Imagine you are standing in a river. The current is strong, and you are fighting to stay upright against it. Now imagine stepping onto the bank and watching the river flow past. The water is exactly the same. The current is exactly the same. But your relationship to it is completely different. You are no longer inside it. Defusion is the step onto the bank. Here are 3 defusion techniques that are practical, evidence-informed, and require nothing except a moment of deliberate attention. These come directly from the ACT framework and from the broader literature on thought observation and metacognitive awareness. The first move is naming the process. When a difficult thought arrives, you add a short prefix to it. Instead of, "I am going to fail," you say to yourself, "I am having the thought that I am going to fail." That phrase, "I am having the thought that," does something precise. It inserts a small gap between you and the thought. It makes the process visible. You are no longer inside the thought looking out. You are noticing the thought from the outside looking at it. The content has not changed. Your position relative to it has. Some people take this one step further and name the kind of thought it is. My mind is doing the catastrophe thing again. My mind is giving me the not good enough story. Giving the pattern a name creates even more distance, and it also reduces the sense that the thought is new and urgent, because you recognize it as something familiar your mind does. The second move is leaves on a stream. This one requires about 60 seconds of deliberate practice. Close your eyes if that is comfortable, or just let your gaze settle. Imagine a slow stream, and imagine that each thought you have is a leaf floating past on the surface of the water. Your only job is to watch the leaves float by, not to analyze them, not to judge them, not to follow them downstream, just to notice each one and let it continue past. When you find yourself pulled back into thinking rather than watching, which will happen, you simply note that and return to watching. The practice is not about achieving perfect detachment. It is about repeatedly catching the difference between being inside a thought and observing it. The third move is the one word. This is the simplest and fastest defusion technique, and it is particularly useful when a thought shows up in the middle of something else. When a difficult thought arrives, you add one word before it, the word thinking. Thinking, "I am going to fail." Thinking, "I am not good enough." The single word is enough to reframe the experience from "this is true" to "this is a thought I am having." It takes less than a second. It does not require a meditation cushion or 20 minutes of quiet. It requires only that one deliberate syllable. So here is what this episode has built. Your mind produces thoughts constantly, and some of them are very difficult. The default relationship most people have to those thoughts is fusion. The thought and the person become one thing. The content feels like a verdict, and behavior narrows in response. This is not a flaw. It is what minds do. Defusion does not ask you to stop the thoughts or replace them with better ones. It asks you to notice that there is a you doing the observing, and that this observer is not the same thing as the contents of what is being observed. That distinction is small in theory and large in practice. 3 moves to take with you. First, name the process. I am having the thought that. Second, practice leaves on a stream when you have a quiet minute. Third, use the one word, thinking, when a difficult thought arrives in a busy moment. None of these will make your mind quiet. They will make you less at the mercy of its noise. If this material is touching something that feels bigger than a difficult thought here or there, that is worth noting. Patterns of fusion that cause real suffering respond well to work with a trained therapist. Acceptance and commitment therapy has a strong evidence base and is widely available. If this gave you a new way to see your own thinking, subscribe, because the next episode goes deeper into the machinery behind the inner voice, specifically why you believe the things you believe about yourself, and where those core beliefs actually came from. Before you go, I want to hear from you. The next time a difficult thought shows up, which of these 3 moves feels most like something you could actually do in that moment? Tell me in the comments. I will see you in the next one.